We took a little break from Genesis to talk about easy stuff like politics for a month, so we're all done with that. And now we're going to jump back into a story that has been unfolding now for quite a few months as we've been working through all this foundational stuff. Today specifically, as we jump back into the middle of the stream of this family, Abraham and Jacob and Isaac, we're going to kind of catch back up with them. But I got a question for you that I would like you to think about as we get into that. So to make it personal, have you ever found yourself in a relationship within your own family, or maybe extended family or close relationships, where you had somebody that you felt like was working intentionally, actively, and deceitfully against you? Have you ever felt like that from a close personal relationship where you just felt like they were against you? Or, maybe worse, have you ever been that person? Like you ever had a time, and this is what this looks like. Somebody in your family doesn't like, and they get brought up, and then you join right in and you start making fun of them. Right? You start continuing that gossip because it just feels good to climb a little bit higher on the totem pole than somebody else. And so with Thanksgiving coming up, I know now this message might be difficult for all of you because all of you have perfect families and you don't have to worry about these things. But if you have like an event like Thanksgiving coming and you have maybe people that you're not normally with, how will that be? How will you talk? I showed that video last Sunday about, hey, if you don't agree with people politically, cut them out of your lives. Tell them why you're cutting them out of your lives. And like that mentality, what if you have people like that? Or what if you were tempted to be like that? So all this messiness of what that does within a family is what we're going to see today. Because a real question I want you to wrestle with is, what kind of seeds are you sowing in your family? Like, think about that. What are you doing within the relationship within your siblings, with your parents, your aunts, your uncles, extended family, whatever the thing might be? What kind of seeds are you sowing, particularly maybe with your kids? What kind of culture are you building? You're always building culture one way or the other. So today you're going to see a lot of things come to fruition that have been happening now for generations. And it's really difficult on these people. And so today in Genesis 30, we're going to explore the relationship between two very flawed individuals. This guy Laban and his son-in-law Jacob, and all the just toxicity that goes with these two. And I want you to hear the whole narrative this morning. It's a little bit different than I normally do. I don't usually tackle this much of Scripture all at once, but this is a story that starts, and it doesn't really, you don't see the fruition of it until the end of this narrative. It's one of the longer ones actually in Scripture, and I didn't want to break it up because I know sometimes, maybe we can't make the next Sunday or like remember the next Sunday. And so I just want to make sure we hit it all so that you can see these things that we can learn. Because there's two times in the New Testament, like why read these stories? There's two times in the New Testament that says specifically, these stories have been preserved so that we can learn from them, so that we might not sin like them. So New Testament, everything after Jesus, is 2,000 years later than what we're going to be reading this morning. What we're reading this morning for us is 4,000 years ago. Why this is valuable today in 2024 is because times change, but people don't. Like, man, we're pretty much the same all along. We still want to be selfish. We still want to be prideful. We're still capable of doing amazing things. God thankfully works in the midst of messiness and ugliness and our bitterness and all this kind of stuff. So that's what we're going to look at with Genesis. Because in Genesis, as a quick recap, to get us up to chapter 30, because that's where we are now, to get us up there, I want to do a quick recap, just so you kind of know and understand what are the dynamics that have gone into what we're going to hear about today. So big picture. The book of Genesis is the book of beginnings. That's what Genesis is. So, if you find yourself reading this book, and it was written in Hebrew originally, and you picked up that Hebrew Bible, it wouldn't be called Genesis, it would be called Bereshit. And in Hebrew, that's in the beginning, so it's beginning. So, Bereshit bara Elohim, that's the very first phrase of the Bible, and it frames the whole Bible. In the beginning, God. Bereshit bara Elohim. So that's where Genesis gets its name from, but why do we call it Genesis? That's a Greek word. So when the Greeks came along, they took the Hebrew Old Testament, they turned it into Greek. That Greek word there, Genesis, means origins or beginnings. That's where we literally get that name from, is because that's what it means. And Genesis sets the framework for the whole Bible. You understand salvation better. You understand why we need Jesus better. You understand that Jesus wasn't an accident. You understand that when we celebrate Christmas next month, that story actually began here in Genesis and promises that were made that we've already covered. You understand a lot of the dynamics of the whole Bible, relationships, everything has its beginning here. Our understanding of not just creation, not just humanity, but our understanding of sin and its consequences all come from this book. And so it's a really, really important place to start. Even some of the main stories that so many people know, even if you're not a Christian, Adam and Eve, right, the most infamous couple ever, sin and the fall of humanity we find here. Cain, killing his brother Abel, we find here. Noah, the global flood, all these stories that we all know probably well, even if we weren't raised in church, and then the Tower of Babylon. All happened Genesis 1 through 11. Genesis chapters 1 through 11, all the proto-history stuff, such foundational stuff. But then you switch to Genesis chapter 12, and you meet this guy Abraham. And Abraham is famous for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons he's important is because he's the very first Jewish person. Not many people groups, not many ethnic groups can say, oh yeah, that person, that was the first one. But Judaism traces its beginning all the way back to this guy Abraham. And so he starts the promise. God makes a promise to him, and he says, look, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to give you land. I'm going to give you generations. And the world, most importantly, the world will be blessed through you. Now, that comes to fruition at Christmas time. And that's what we're going to celebrate next month. We're actually going to look at that connection. But he says that's going to happen. And so we then meet Abraham and Sarah, a very messy couple. They sin a lot. They lie a lot. Abraham throws Sarah under the bus a lot. He offers her up as like his own little personal sacrifice a lot, and it's very messy. God has to intervene and protect her more than once. But the promise that they're both given is that you're going to have a son. And they're like, no, we're crazy old. We can't have kids. And God's like, all right, so I created the universe. I can probably make this happen. So then he does. Isaac then comes along, the son of promise. Now, Isaac is very important because, again, the world is going to be blessed through this son, Isaac. And that's Jesus. We'll get to that next month. Now, Isaac, though, he's going to grow up and he's going to have his own family. So Isaac is going to marry this woman, Rebekah, and they're going to have two kids, Jacob and Esau. Now we're catching up to where we are now. Jacob and Esau are twins. Esau is just a little bit older, and these two are always in competition with one another in a super unhealthy way because they want to get the love and favor of their parents. So here's what happens with Jacob and Esau. This is where the seeds of deception now go to the second generation that Abraham has now passed on. Again, I'm asking you this morning, what kind of culture are you building in your family? With your parents, with your siblings, aunts, uncles, extended family, whatever it is. What kind of sowing are we doing? Because now we're seeing this deception pass to the second family, or the second and third generation, because now Jacob is going to partner up with his mom, Rebekah, and deceive his brother, Esau, deceive his own father, and he's going to steal two very important things to them, maybe not to us, but to them in their world, the birthright and the blessing from the father. Jacob's going to get both of those from Esau. Obviously, Esau's not very happy, so there's immediate animosity there, but the broken and fractured family is already a reality. So then Jacob and Esau go their separate ways. Esau takes a slight back seat now in this narrative, and then we have Jacob going off to find himself a wife. Now, when he does this, he goes and meets his match. Jacob is a deceiver, but he's going to meet his match in his uncle Laban. Laban is going to wreck this dude's life because he's going to run him through almost 20 years of deception. Because here's what happens when he shows up. Jacob sees this pretty girl, Rachel, and he's like, hey, we should get hitched. And hey, Laban, I really want to marry this girl. And he's like, oh, that's cool. He gets him all liquored up on his wedding night, puts him in the dark tent, and then he sends in Leah, the older daughter, to Jacob. And they have some mommy-daddy time, consummate the marriage, and now he is deceitfully, by his own now wife, Leah, and by his father-in-law, he's been deceived into marrying her. He's worked 7 years for a woman that he did not get. And that's the reality, the harshness of that world back then. Women were treated like cattle. This is going to come back later. The daughters are going to call their own dad out on this, what he did to them. Then Rachel, he has to work another 7 years for her, so 14 years of his life has gone by. And here's why it's so messy. Leah and Rachel now compete for their husband's love. So this deceit, lying, superstition, all gets passed on to the point now where they're competing so much for Jacob's love that they are now pulling in their slave women, Back then in this world, again, how women get treated by these people is not God's design. This is sinful people doing sinful things. So they pull in these slave women, and they start having surrogate children. So now Jacob's got now 4 wives, and he's got a daughter and 11 boys. And the 12th hasn't been born yet. Benjamin hasn't been born yet, but he's got 11 boys that are going to make up the 12 tribes of Israel eventually. And so there you can see the messiness of this, the chaos of this, of them going back and forth. And Leah and Rachel even get to the point there at the end of having kids of introducing superstition. They start trading fruit and bartering for Jacob's love. They're like, all right, I'll give you some mandrake fruit if I can have him tonight. Like, that's the kind of deals they're rolling out with one another. That's their relationship. So I say all that to get us up to the point of like, okay, we're going to pick up in Genesis 30, and she's just had Joseph. So all that toxicity, all that unhealthy family stuff, all those seeds of deception and lying and selfishness are now going to start to really bear fruit in this family's life. And it's going to start to, you're going to see it mushrooming out in different ways. So as we jump into today then, I just want you to make it personal. I want you to make this personal. You've all got people in your families that are difficult. In your family, you might be the difficult one. So this can land really well for us. Because again, why do we have this stuff 4,000 years later? Why did God preserve these people and their stories for so long? So that we could learn something. So the question I want you to wrestle with this morning for yourself is, how can you personally contribute to family solutions instead of family problems? This, for me, is a real question. It's a real question. I did this. For those of you that don't know, I went home a few weeks ago, because my dad died. And while I was there was a lot of unhealthy dynamics, I guess, in our family. I wasn't fully aware of. I kind of knew, but I didn't know why. And so I could see the tension, I could see and feel the tension when I talked to this family member and that family member, and I was like, oh man, well, what am I going to do? So then I had to make that decision. Like, okay, I could kind of talk about them. I could be like, ha, ha, ha. Or I could just love those people. And so I had to make the decision, I want to be a part of the solution. So what I got to do is hang out with some family I hadn't seen in more than 2 decades. I got to go to church with one of my family members I hadn't seen in 25 years. And that was really cool. But there's some tension there because of generational stuff. Like generations above me, things happened, and it's affecting all of the great-grandkids and all the great nieces and nephews and all this kind of stuff. And so it's like we all have this, and we all got to figure out how we wrestle with these things. So tips for toxic family. So in Genesis 30, we're going to be, like I said, it's a bigger chunk. I'm not going to read it all. I'm going to kind of summarize some of it, but I want us to see what's happening in these people's lives. All right, so here we go. Jump in. So after Rachel, remember one of the sisters, after Rachel gave birth to Joseph, the second to the last son, Jacob said to Laban, "Send me on my way so I can return to my homeland." So he's been now about 400 or so miles away. He's been there now at least 14 years. He's been there a very long time. He wants to get out of there. He's like, you've been taking advantage of me now for almost 20 years. It's time for me to go. I want to go back home. I only came here for a wife, and then my whole life got sucked up. Verse 26, "Give me my wives," and this is the reality for these women, "give me my wives and my children that I have worked for." That it's almost transactional. "And let me go. You know how hard I have worked for you." So just because this is happening in this story here in Genesis does not mean this is God's design. How these people are treated is not God's design, but this is the reality of the world that they live in. And here is God. This is the beautiful undertones of the Genesis stories, a lot of them, is people are being sinful, people are not doing things according to God's design, and yet God still is working with them. On the other hand, he's going to let them have the consequences. So for those of us that are like, oh, God knows me and he still loves me and he'll let me do whatever I want, he will, and then also let you have the consequences that go with that, right? But I love that God's faithfulness is just in the midst of all these things happening. So, these wives are being treated like cattle. They know it. This point comes back up here in a minute. So he says, "I've worked hard for you," but Laban said to him, if I have found favor with you, stay." Laban, again, the master manipulator, he's like, "I have learned by divination that your Lord has blessed me because of you." Then Laban said, "Name your wages and I will pay them." He knows 2 things are about to happen. He knows that 14 years of blessing are about to walk out the door. And he also knows that he needs to manipulate this guy again to try to get more out of him. So my livelihood is about to leave. Jacob responds and he says, "The Lord has blessed you because of me." True. And now When will I also do something for my own family?" And Laban asks, "Well, what should I give you?" So here's Jacob's plan. I'll just summarize it. He says, all right, all these sheep and all these female goats, let's separate them, like the speckled one, the spotted ones, the dark ones. Like, let's call all these out so that you know what's yours and what's mine. This is ancient currency here. So this is like him saying, okay, I'll take the Ford dealership and the Audi dealership. You get the Chevy dealership and then also the Fiat dealership, okay? Because like that's yours, this is mine. Like that's the separating line. So we know what's going on here. Laban is like, yeah, sounds like a great plan. But Laban is the master deceiver. So once again, he's going to take advantage of Jacob, sowing more seeds of deceit and lies. And he's going to have his own sons call all those out that Jacob said, hey, all the speckled, spotted, and dark ones. Like, he's like, yeah, sure. He gets all of those, gives them to his son, and then he sends them all off. So the very thing that Jacob said, hey, this is what we'll do, he's like, okay, cool, I'll just take all yours and I'll get rid of them. So now Jacob has, again, nothing. So Jacob now has been deceived once more. All of his own potential property has left, bringing us to our first principle, that I am looking at this story and I'm seeing how this echoes out later, asking the question again, how can we contribute to family solutions instead of family problems? The first one here is practicing generosity, not selfishness. I've seen a lot of family dynamics when I counsel, when I talk, when I listen to people at the grocery store or wherever else. It's like this generosity piece instead of selfishness can go so far. It's so Christ-like. How can I bless you and not take advantage of you? Is a very Christ-like way, a very godly way to operate your relationships. But so many people, it's just, what can I get out of you? What have you done for me lately? And that just, like, when we start sowing that, man, that just wrecks our hearts. After this, in response to what Laban did to him, Jacob does something that I remember reading early on when I was a younger Christian and reading Genesis. I read this next passage that I'm about to read to you, and I was like, what kind of voodoo magic are these people practicing? Like, what in the world is Jacob doing? So I wanted, rather than just summarize it, I want to read it to you to explain what's going on here. So verse 37, Jacob then took branches of fresh poplar, almond, and plane wood, and he, picture this, he peels back the bark, exposing white stripes on the branches. He then set the peeled branches in the troughs in front of the sheep, in the water channels where the sheep came out to drink. And the sheep bred when they came to drink. The flocks bred in front of the branches and bore streaked, speckled, and spotted young. Jacob separated the lambs and made the flocks face the streaked sheep and the completely dark sheep in Laban's flocks. Then he set his own stock apart and didn't put them with Laban's sheep. Whenever the stronger of the flock were breeding, Jacob placed the branches in the troughs, in full view of the flocks, and they would breed in front of the branches. As for the weaklings of the flocks, he did not put out the branches. So it turned out that the weak sheep belonged to Laban and the stronger ones to Jacob. And the man became, and this is their currency, he became very rich. He had many flocks, female and male slaves, camels and donkeys. So again, I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, like, what kind of voodoo magic is happening right now? Is this like, this can't be a real thing. Like, how? And then so I started to research this. So this right here is folklore farming 4,000 years ago. So this is what they would do. Again, just because something is happening culturally, and that's okay, doesn't mean it's godly. It doesn't mean it's okay with God. So just like his wives did when they're trading mandrakes in a superstitious way to try to get pregnant and try to curry favor with Jacob, he's doing something else that's culturally superstitious. And so now he's doing something, and another example of God working with people that don't look to him, but look to like these weird things that we do. It's like, I want to hear from God, but what's my horoscope say? It's like, we're like jumping into other stuff, but we want God's help, and it's like the both and that we get into. And so God is working in the midst of that in spite of what they're doing. And so God chose to work because he made a promise. He said, I am going to bless you. I am going to take care of you. So not only is God doing that, but in a very real sense, we just have selective breeding being done by a very skilled herdsman also. Jacob knew what he was doing. He was very successful at what he did. And so when you see this kind of stuff, again, you kind of have to read in like what's happening culturally. So then, following this, the result of all this, what he's been doing, so Jacob hears what Laban's sons were saying. And they're saying, Jacob has taken all that was our father's and has built this wealth from what belonged to our father. And Jacob saw from Laban's face that his attitude toward him was not the same as before. So now we got like a little Godfather scenario happening here, right? We got some problems now. So the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your ancestors and to your family, and I will be with you. Again, keeping the promise he made to Abraham. So Jacob's plan is like, okay, we got to get out of here. Bad things are going to happen. These guys got bad intentions for me. I still trust God. He's saying he's going to take care of us. Let's go. Let's get all of our stuff. Goes to his wives. He says, look, your dad's pretty upset with me, but he's been cheating me now for 14 years. So he's getting what he deserves, but God's going to take care of us. So we got to go. This is one of the first times now you're going to see the fruition of Laban's choices, of his selfishness, of his deceit, what he's been doing to his daughters, how he's been treating his daughters. You're going to see now how they feel about him. And I see this a lot in parent-child relationships. The parent has just been using their kid for their own enjoyment, their own laughs. They're always wrecking their kid. They're always blah, 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 blah. And now all of a sudden their child reacts against that. And then the parent's all upset, doesn't understand. Now this is their reaction. This is the daughter's reaction to their father. Rachel and Leah say, do we have any portion or inheritance of our father's family? No, we're done. We're done. We got nothing left. Verse 15. Are we not regarded by him as outsiders? For he has sold us. They know what happened to them. He has sold us and certainly spent our purchase price. In fact, all the wealth that God has taken from our father belongs to us and to our children. So do whatever God has said to you. That right there, you're seeing what he has done to them and how that's making them feel. So which brings us to our second thing that we see and learn from this family. If you want to contribute to your family solutions instead of the problems, don't treat people like pawns. Again, I see this a lot. This could be as close as a husband and a wife. The husband thinks that his wife is there just to serve him and do everything for him. The wife thinks her husband is there to work his tail off and kill himself so they can have all the material stuff that they don't need. It's they just see that person as fulfilling a role in their life. Kids, naturally, we look at our parents when we're younger, right? Our parents are there to meet all of our needs, whether it's a Band-Aid or whether it's an allowance that we didn't earn or whatever the thing is, right? We can naturally slide into that as kids because we just assume, well, they do everything for me. You can do that with any relationship. Any relationship you can slide into, well, they're just here for me. And we start treating people like that, and that pushes them away. And we got more stuff going on in our families. We don't know why. So these are things we can learn from these very imperfect people. So here's what happens. When Laban had gone to shear a sheep, in light of all this stuff, Rachel then, she steals her father's household idols. These would have been little carved things that Laban would have used to worship and pray to his gods. Again, 2024, we're yeah, whatever. But that's she stole his iPhone. Yeah, now people are yeah, what? Right? And it's so it's something like that. Very important that she stole from him. And so then the second deception then, again, it's just the seeds are now all growing up. They're all growing up in this family. Verse 20, and Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean, not telling him that he was fleeing. So verse 21, he flees with all his possessions, and he crossed the Euphrates and headed for the hill country of Gilead. So Laban, in response to this, obviously pretty upset. Verse 23, he took his relatives with him, so all these grown people, now grown men, and he pursued Jacob. Think about this. For 7 days, and he overtook them in the hill country of Gilead. This is 300 miles that he pursues them for. So that's almost to Baltimore from here. That's almost to Rochester, New York. That's like me getting so upset with somebody and being Brittany, get the kids and the camels. We're going to Rochester. It's crazy. And then I'm going to chase the person down for 7 days. And think about that. It's easy just to read through these details, but think about the tension that builds over a week. Imagine if somebody had really made you mad enough to drop everything and chase them on a camel for a week. Imagine how you feel at the end of 7 days. And all the guys that you brought with you, they're heading out with bad intentions. They're like, we are going to get there and we're going to stomp Jacob into the ground. We'll take our sisters back and their kids, and steal all the stuff. But this dude is going to pay for what he did. That's the environment that's like right now happening, right? So he chases him for 7 days. But God shows up to Laban in the night with a dream and he says, watch yourself. Don't say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. So that English is a little tricky there because it's like, can he not say anything? But literally in Hebrew it says, speaking from good until bad. So probably what God has said to him is like, look, don't you dare go outside the bounds of what you're going to go and say. Like, don't you think you're going to do anything to this guy? Why? Because he is part of the promise. And I'm going to protect the promise. So Laban, don't you dare put a hand on him. Right? So that's kind of the warning that he gets. So then verse 25, he finally catches Jacob, and Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country, and then on the other side, kind of picture this like little mini valley there, Laban and his relatives also pitched their tents in the hill country of Gilead. So think about the lineup here. You got Jacob, his wives, some slave women, their little kids, and like a bunch of goats. So it's like, bah, right? And then on the other side, you've got grown men, loaded for bear, ready with bad intentions. Like that's kind of the setting that's happening right now. So Laban shows up, and this is the card that he plays. He says, what have you done? So now he's a victim. He's going to show up and be a victim. You have deceived me and taken my daughters away like prisoners of war. First problem. Why did you secretly flee from me, deceive me, and not tell me? That's a toxic family trait if ever there was one, to show up and wrongly play the victim. So that brings us to our third thing. If you want to contribute to your family being healthy instead of it being toxic, what can you do? Well, don't wrongly play the victim or gaslight others about what you've done. I see this happen a lot. Just terrible, terrible things being said, done, passive aggressiveness, all this stuff, all this un-Christ-like stuff, and then they are upset about what their family is doing to them and how they are reacting. And then they want to say, well, no, you're a Christian, you need to forgive. And it's just this unhealthy, toxic cycles. I see this happen a lot. And again, what can we learn from these people and the mistakes that they are making? Because Laban's making all of them today, just about. So here's the second thing that Laban does. The audacity he has to say this. He said, I would have sent you away with joy and singing, with tambourines and lyres. Like, if I was Jacob, I'd be like, bro, you are a liar. Like, what are you talking about? Like, there is nothing in our relationship that would say that you're going to send me away with these kinds of things, ever. Like, we know who you are. But then he goes back now to being a victim. Verse 28. He says, you didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren, tears, and my daughters. You have acted foolishly. This is all your fault. I've been doing this for 14 years or more to you, and my daughters, and my grandkids, and now I'm the victim. Right? Unhealthy, playing the victim, toxic stuff. Like this is the card that he plays. So the question, how can you contribute instead of making more problems? How can you contribute to solutions? Number 4, don't make empty promises. Because this creates a pattern. People don't believe you anymore. Right? And then when things go bad, you're like, oh, this, and this, and you promise the moon, and everybody knows you won't do it. And then you're upset because nobody believes you. Because the seeds you have been sowing, just like Laban. Nobody trusts this guy. Nobody believes his boo-hooing or his victimhood, but this is the card that he's playing. Then he flexes on Jacob a little bit. He says, I could do you great harm, because now he's probably looking behind him. He's got all his guys. But last night, the God of your father said to me, watch yourself. Don't say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Now you've gone off because you long for your father's family. But why? Why have you, problem number 2, stolen my gods? And Jacob answered, I was afraid. I thought you'd take your daughters from me by force. So still struggling a little bit to trust God here, because the hard reality is it's easy to trust God when it's easy, right? And it's hard to trust God when it's hard. Like that's what he's up against right now. It's like the enemy's at the door. What am I going to do? The bills are not going to get paid. What am I going to do? I got a family member that's coming after me. I got a boss that's lying about me, a coworker that's blaming something on me. I got, just last night talking with a girl. I did all the work on our project and our teacher gave us both the same grade, right? It's like life is tough. It's unfair. And it's like, what do we do when we get into those spaces? So then he says, foolishly, Jacob says this, real proud. He says, if you find your gods with anyone here, he will not live. Before our relatives, point out anything that is yours and take it. Sad irony here, of course, he doesn't know that Rachel had stolen the idols. Doesn't know that's happened, and now he just makes this bold statement. He's so confident, you can go ahead and kill anybody. So now, he says that, and I want you to picture this next scene. So here's Laban. He's got all these guys behind him, right? He's got his whole family there ready to do bad things if they need to. And now, the patriarch of this family, Laban, is going to go angrily from tent to tent. All you're hearing is like the scuffling of his little sandals, like he's running around. He's overturning stuff. He's all angry. He's probably saying some choice words because he can't find his precious iPhone. And he's like, what's going on here? And everybody else is watching and waiting and wondering what is going to happen. Is he going to find these things or not? So Laban went into Jacob's tent first, then Leah's tent, and the tents of the two concubines. But he found nothing. When he left Leah's tent, the older sister, he went to Rachel's tent, the younger. Now Rachel had taken Laban's household idols, put them in the saddlebag of the camel, and sat on them. And Laban searched the whole tent, but found nothing. Again, no one's talking. Tension is building. What's going to happen? Rachel's like, my husband just offered me up to be killed by my father. 35, how does Rachel get out of it? She says to her father, don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand up in your presence. Why can't I stand up? Because I am having my period. Can you imagine that as a father hearing that? Like, that's end of story. That's game over. That's pack it up and let's get out of here, guys. I don't want anything to do with that. So Laban is like, all right. So he searched kind of like, maybe casually at that point, and he's like looking at his daughter, and he's like, I don't really want to go there. But he could find nothing, couldn't find the household idols. So deceit upon deceit upon deceit upon deceit. So again, how do you contribute to solutions instead of problems? Number 5, you should do what Laban should have asked many times. Will my actions bless or poison my family? He never stopped to ask what kind of impact he was having on his family. He was getting the goods, so to speak. He was getting the blessing, but he never stopped to ask, the way that I'm being, the way that I'm treating my daughters, their husband, my grandchildren, like, what is that going to do for me long term? And he's already lost his daughters. He doesn't have the trust of anybody else. He's going to lose now a lot of wealth because of what he did. So that's the reality of his choices. So he never stopped to ask this really important question. So then the narrative ends. Jacob then calls him out. He takes the opportunity now to call Laban out. And he says, look, man, you have been moving the goalpost on me for about 20 years. I have been the one giving this blessing. I've been the one working in the cold, working in the heat. I've lost sleep. If any animals die, I took the loss. I've done everything for you. And then he ends that little statement by saying, without God, I would have been lost. That's how wrong you have done me for so many years. So on the positive, and this last one's difficult, number 6, if you want to contribute to family solutions instead of just like feeding into the toxicity, the last thing you want to do is speak up and call out what's been done wrong. That's a really important step to take, to actually call things out. But unfortunately, when we're hurt, we usually do that with animosity. We do that with bitterness. We tend to do it in a way that we want to make the other person look terrible or like guilty in a way that everybody no longer trusts them, or creating a rumor. Like when we call things out, we need to make sure we just do it in a straightforward way. Say, look, this has not been right. Thankfully, in this situation, it works out well. Laban actually is like, oh man, my bad. They signed a peace treaty. Not really signing a peace treaty, but they agree. They set up some stones because that's what they did back then. And then importantly, another thing they do is they share a meal together. Now that to us, 2024, is like whatever. They shared a meal together, so what? So let me show you a cool little story from a professor I had in college. So this is back in 2008. He shared this. My professor was a Christian, and he grew up in Chechnya, which is on the other side of the planet. And while he was there, living as an adult, there was a terrorist, and I can't to this day remember the guy's name, but this guy was well known in that area because there was a lot of terrorism happening then. And this guy was a pretty bad dude. Hundreds of people have been killed, car bombings, the whole deal, like a bad dude. So my professor said he was writing, and this was a class about ethnic tensions and ethnic realities and ethnic cultures and like the differences and all that kind of stuff. So he says he's on a train, and they're not quite to the train station yet, and it stops in the middle of this field, in the middle of nowhere. So my professor said, he's like looking out the window, he's like, and everybody's starting to freak out. He's like, oh man, something must have happened. So he says, then all of a sudden people start fleeing the train, like running for their lives off of the train out into this random field. And he's like, well, that can't be good, so he's thinking something's wrong with the train. But then all of a sudden he looks up, and coming through the door of the car in front of him, he sees this guy, this terrorist, has taken over their train. He's just gotten on, and he says, this is mine now. And so he's like, ooh, this is really not good. And so he said the only card he knew he had to play was he understood this guy, his culture, his family, and what he knew to be true. So my professor, I still can't believe this to this day, told this guy, we need to eat a meal. The guy told him to get off the train, and he says, no, we need to share a meal. Because in that culture, he knew he's older than this guy. That guy can't say no to that request. So this guy, this terrorist, who literally had been on the news recently, just killing hundreds of people, sits down in the seat right across from my professor, and he says he just stares at him. You imagine that? And you're like the professor, your professor with your goggles and your like padded elbows, right? And he's like sitting there staring at this guy, and he's just like, oh man. And he's hoping this guy's going to like do the right thing. And he does. He's like, all right, we'll get a meal. He tells his guys, his little like lackeys, to go get him food from the food cart. They bring it back, they set it in front of him, and the guys are sitting there, and he's like, go ahead and eat. But then my professor says I had to take one last leap because I needed this guy to understand the relationship we were in, me being the older guy and my life being on the line, he said. He says, no, I need you to serve me. And this guy easily has the power to end his life at any moment. And he's just like, I need you to serve me. And the guy, again, just stares at him. And again, the guy's like, all right, starts cutting up his food and serves it to my professor. Elbow pads, glasses, the whole deal, like receding hairline. Like this guy understood the culture. Meals shared today, even in certain parts of the world, are an incredibly important thing. So when they seal this deal, there's lots of messiness that follows, but in their world, that's a really important thing that they just did. So it's like, oh yeah, they ate and then they left. No, like a really big thing just happened because of how Jacob handled himself. In spite of everything going on, God protected the promise and he sealed the deal and it was all done. So he leaves, he takes off and says goodbye, and he gets his kisses from his daughters and his granddaughters. So there's more messiness that comes out of that, but the thing I want you to think about, again, apply contextually to your own life. These 6 things, how can we contribute to family solutions instead of problems? 1, what do we learn from Laban? What do we constantly see from this guy? Well, practice generosity, not selfishness. Number 2, don't treat your family or people in your circle like pawns. They're not there for you. If you're a follower of Jesus, you're there for them. That's upside down. Number 3, don't play victim. Don't wrongly play victim or gaslight others about what you've done. Don't make other people feel crazy about you being a terrible person. That's a good tip. Number 4, don't make empty promises. People will know. People will figure it out. They won't believe you, and then you'll get upset. You'll wonder why nobody believes you because you always make empty promises. Don't do it. Number 5, lastly, what should Laban have done so many times a part of this journey? Well, he should have said, well, my actions bless or poison my family. Am I going to lose everything because I'm trying to take advantage of these pawns in my life? But he never did. And then lastly, it is okay to speak up, call out when things are done wrong. Don't just be silent about it. Get help if you need to, figuring out how to do that. Right? And so in just this one account, there's so many other things. I don't know how maybe God spoke to you specifically, but there's like all these things that we can pull out of these people and the stories that they live, the mistakes that they made, the triumphs that they have. Genesis, family matters for sure. All right, let me pray. Lord, I thank you for today, and I pray you'd impress on our hearts, God, whatever we need to do with this. The family is so important to you, Lord, and I pray that we would see that as well, whether it's our immediate or extended or just people in our circle. God, help us to be mindful of our relationships. Help us to be Christ-like and godly in the way that we treat people, the way that we see them. Lord, we need your help with this stuff, because when we have people that are being toxic to us, it's really hard, Jesus, to be Christ-like. So I pray, Lord, that you give us the strength and the courage and the wisdom to do what's right. We just need your help, Lord. So again, press this into our hearts, whatever this looks like. And I pray that in your name, Jesus Christ. And his church said, amen. It was great seeing you all this week. Have a great week.